The morning mist clung to the pine trees like smoke from dying campfires as Thomas McKenna checked his rifle one last time. The September air in the Arizona Territory carried the promise of winter, crisp and clean in a way that made every breath feel like drinking from a mountain stream. He had been planning this hunt for weeks, waiting for the perfect conditions when the elk would be moving through the high country, following the ancient paths their kind had walked for countless generations. Thomas was not a man who enjoyed company on his hunting trips. At 32, he had learned that silence was often more valuable than conversation, and the wilderness had taught him lessons that no amount of talk around a saloon table ever could. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he secured his pack, checking the jerky, hardtack, and coffee that would sustain him for the 3 days he planned to spend in the mountains. His horse, a sturdy bay mare named Copper, stood patiently as he tied down his bedroll and made sure his ammunition was secure. The town of Cedar Ridge had been his home for nearly 5 years now, ever since he had drifted in from Kansas with little more than his horse, his rifle, and a desire to leave the past behind. He worked as a carpenter and sometimes helped the local ranchers during roundup, but it was these solitary journeys into the high country that truly fed his soul. The mountains asked nothing of him except respect, and they gave back a peace that he had never found among people. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the mist, Thomas guided Copper up a narrow trail that switchbacked through stands of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. The path was old, worn smooth by generations of deer, elk, and the occasional hunter brave enough to venture this far into country that most white settlers still considered dangerous. Apache raids had been common enough in recent years, though Thomas had never encountered any of the native people during his hunting expeditions. He carried an awareness of their presence the way he carried his rifle, always there, always ready, but not something that consumed his thoughts. The trail led higher into country that few white men had seen, where ancient rock formations jutted from the earth like the bones of sleeping giants. Thomas had discovered this hunting ground by accident 2 years earlier, following wounded elk that had led him far from any marked trail. What he had found was a hidden valley, protected by steep ridges and accessible only through a narrow canyon that could easily be missed if a man did not know where to look. By midday, Thomas had reached the rim of his secret valley. Below him spread a meadow that ran for nearly a mile between protective ridges, fed by a clear stream that tumbled down from the higher peaks. Aspen trees lined the water, their leaves already beginning to turn the gold that would soon paint the mountainside. This was elk country, and Thomas had never failed to find game here. He made his camp in a grove of pine trees that offered shelter from the wind and a clear view of the meadow below. His movements were economical and practiced as he unsaddled Copper and set up his simple camp. No fire during the day. The smoke might spook the animals he had come to hunt. He would wait for evening, when the elk came down to drink, and then he would have his chance. The afternoon passed slowly, as hunting always did for those who understood the value of patience. Thomas cleaned his rifle and checked his ammunition, then settled against a large pine tree to wait and watch. The meadow seemed empty at first, but gradually the smaller inhabitants revealed themselves. A family of mule deer picked their way delicately through the tall grass. A red-tailed hawk circled high overhead, riding the thermals that rose from the sun-warmed earth. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called to its mate. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Thomas finally saw what he had come for. A small herd of elk emerged from the trees on the far side of the meadow, moving with the careful alertness of animals that lived always on the edge of danger. There were perhaps a dozen of them, including a magnificent bull whose antlers caught the late afternoon light like polished bone. Thomas moved carefully, working his way down into the valley while staying within the cover of the trees. The wind was in his favor, carrying his scent away from the animals. He had learned long ago that success in hunting depended far more on patience and understanding than on the accuracy of his shot, though he was proud of his skill with a rifle. He had positioned himself within easy range of the herd when the sound reached him, faint but unmistakable. It was the sound of someone in pain, a low moan that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the herd of elk. The animals heard it too, their heads lifting in alert concern before they bounded away into the safety of the trees. Thomas waited, listening. The sound came again, definitely human and definitely in distress. His first instinct was caution. In this country, a sound like that could easily be a trap. Apache warriors were known for their cunning, and more than one overconfident white man had walked into an ambush by following what seemed like a cry for help. But the sound came a third time, weaker now, and something in it convinced Thomas that this was no deception. Someone was genuinely hurt, and probably badly. He made his decision quickly, shouldering his rifle and moving carefully toward the source of the sound. The cry led him away from the meadow, up a rocky slope thick with manzanita and scrub oak. The terrain was treacherous here, loose stones that could turn under a man's foot and send him tumbling down the mountainside. Thomas moved carefully, his eyes scanning the ground ahead for any sign of movement. He found her in a small clearing, perhaps 200 yards from where he had first heard her cry. She was an Apache woman, probably in her early 20s, and she was trapped beneath a fallen boulder that had pinned her left leg. Her dark eyes met his with a mixture of pain and defiance that told him she had been here for some time, probably since the previous day or longer. Thomas stopped at the edge of the clearing, his rifle ready but not raised. The woman watched him with the alert stillness of a wild creature that knows it is cornered but has not yet given up the fight. Her long black hair was matted with dirt and pine needles, and her buckskin dress was torn in several places. Blood had dried on her forehead, where she had struck something during her fall. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Thomas could see that she was studying him just as carefully as he was studying her, trying to determine whether he represented salvation or a different kind of danger. Her right hand rested near the handle of a knife at her belt, and despite her trapped condition, he had no doubt that she would use it if she felt threatened. Moving slowly and deliberately, Thomas set his rifle against a nearby tree and raised his hands to show that they were empty. The woman's eyes tracked his every movement, but she said nothing. He had heard enough Apache to recognize a few words, but he doubted his ability to communicate anything complex in her language. Instead, he pointed to the boulder that trapped her leg, then to himself, trying to convey his intention to help. The woman's eyes narrowed, and she spoke for the first time, a rapid stream of Apache that he could not understand. Her tone was not grateful, and Thomas realized that from her perspective, a lone white man discovering her in this vulnerable state was probably not cause for celebration. He tried a different approach, moving very slowly to examine the boulder that held her prisoner. It was larger than he had first thought, probably weighing several hundred pounds. The woman had been gathering pine nuts, he realized, seeing the scattered evidence of her harvest around the clearing. A basket lay overturned nearby, its contents spilled across the rocky ground. The woman had been climbing among the rocks, probably trying to reach the higher branches where the best nuts grew, when this boulder had shifted under her weight. She had managed to pull her upper body clear, but her left leg was firmly pinned from just below the knee. Thomas could see that the leg was almost certainly broken and wondered how she had managed to survive out here for however long she had been trapped. Thomas examined the situation carefully. The boulder was wedged against two smaller rocks in such a way that it would be impossible for him to lift it directly. But he thought he might be able to use a lever, a long, straight piece of wood that could give him the mechanical advantage he needed. He looked around the clearing and found what he was looking for, a dead pine tree that had fallen in some long-ago storm. The trunk was perhaps 8 feet long and thick enough to serve as a lever. Thomas dragged it over to the boulder while the woman watched with curious eyes. Working carefully, he managed to wedge one end of the dead tree beneath the boulder and position it so that he could use another large rock as a fulcrum. The physics were simple enough. If he could get enough leverage, he should be able to lift the boulder just enough for the woman to pull her leg free. The woman seemed to understand what he was attempting, and for the first time, Thomas saw something like hope in her dark eyes. She spoke again, still in Apache, but her tone had changed. She was trying to tell him something important, probably warning him about how badly her leg was injured or asking him to be careful. Thomas positioned himself at the long end of his improvised lever and tested it carefully. The boulder shifted slightly, and he heard the woman gasp. Whether from pain or hope, he could not tell. He knew that he would have only one real chance at this. If he lifted the boulder and she could not get free quickly, he might not be able to hold it long enough for a second attempt. He looked at the woman and nodded, hoping she would understand that this was her moment. Then Thomas put all his strength into the lever, feeling the dead wood bend under the strain as the boulder slowly began to rise. The woman moved faster than he would have thought possible for someone who had been trapped for so long. As soon as there was enough clearance, she pulled her injured leg free and rolled away from the boulder. Thomas let the lever go, and the heavy stone crashed back into place with a sound like thunder. For a moment, both of them simply breathed hard from the effort and the tension. The woman lay on her side, cradling her injured leg, while Thomas examined his impromptu lever to make sure it had not broken under the strain. When he looked back at her, tears were running down her cheeks. Not from pain, he realized, but from relief at being free. Thomas approached her carefully, still moving slowly to avoid alarming her. Up close, he could see that her leg was indeed badly broken, the bone probably fractured in at least 2 places below the knee. The skin was discolored with bruising, and there was some swelling. But miraculously, there was no sign that the bone had broken through the skin. It was a serious injury, but not necessarily a fatal one if it could be properly treated. The woman tried to sit up, winced, and then looked at Thomas with an expression that he found hard to read. She spoke again in Apache, and this time her tone was different, formal, almost ceremonial. Thomas had the feeling that she was thanking him, though he could not be sure. He pointed to himself and said slowly, "Thomas?" Then he pointed to her and raised his eyebrows questioningly. She studied his face for a moment, then touched her chest and said, "Ayanna." The word sounded like music in the mountain air. Thomas looked around the clearing, assessing their situation. The sun was getting low, and the temperature would begin to drop soon. Ayanna was in no condition to travel, and even if she had been, Thomas had no idea where her people might be found. For tonight, at least, they would have to make do here. He retrieved his rifle and then began gathering wood for a fire. Ayanna watched him work, occasionally offering what sounded like suggestions or directions in Apache. Thomas found that he could understand some of her meaning from context and gestures, even when he could not understand her words. By the time full darkness fell, Thomas had built a small but effective shelter using pine boughs and his own blanket. The fire crackled cheerfully in the center of the clearing, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. He had fetched water from a small spring he had discovered nearby, and he had shared his jerky and hardtack with Ayanna, who ate gratefully, despite the obvious pain from her injured leg. As the night deepened around them, Thomas found himself studying this woman who had so completely changed his solitary hunting expedition. She was beautiful, certainly, but there was something more than that. An intelligence in her dark eyes and a strength that showed even in her current vulnerable state. She had survived alone in the wilderness for at least a day, possibly longer, trapped and in pain but never giving up hope. Ayanna had been watching him as well, and when their eyes met across the fire, she smiled for the first time. It was a small smile, tentative and perhaps a little sad, but it transformed her face completely. For just a moment, Thomas forgot that she was Apache and he was white, forgot about the tensions and conflicts that divided their peoples. She was simply a woman who needed help, and he was a man who could provide it. The fire burned lower as the night wore on, and Thomas added more wood to keep the cold at bay. Ayanna had fallen into what appeared to be an exhausted sleep, though he noticed that, even unconscious, she never completely relaxed her guard. Her hand remained near her knife, and at the slightest sound, her eyes would flutter open to assess the situation before she allowed herself to rest again. Thomas sat against a tree trunk, his rifle across his knees, and listened to the sounds of the mountain night. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. An owl hooted from the darkness beyond the firelight. These were the sounds he had come to the mountains to hear, but tonight they carried a different meaning. Tonight, he was responsible for more than just his own safety. As he watched over Ayanna's sleep, Thomas began to understand that his simple hunting trip had become something much more complicated. Come morning, he would have to figure out how to get an injured woman down from these mountains, a woman whose people might shoot him on sight if they encountered him. It was a problem that would require all the mountain wisdom he had gained over the years, and probably a fair amount of luck besides. But looking at Ayanna's peaceful face in the firelight, Thomas realized that he would not change what had happened, even if he could. Some things were more important than a successful hunt, and perhaps this was one of them. The mountains had presented him with a test of a different kind, and he intended to prove himself worthy of it. The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling up toward the star-filled sky, and Thomas McKenna settled in to wait for dawn. Dawn came slowly to the mountain clearing, filtering through the pine trees like honey through cheesecloth. Thomas had dozed fitfully through the night, waking at every sound to check on Ayanna and feed the fire. Now, as the first golden light touched the peaks above them, he studied his companion in the clear morning air and tried to decide what to do next. Ayanna was awake, had probably been awake for some time, watching him with those alert dark eyes. She had said nothing, but Thomas could see the pain lines around her mouth and knew that her broken leg had stiffened during the cold night. Moving would be agony for her, but staying here was not an option. They needed to find help, and that meant getting down from these mountains. Thomas poured water from his canteen into his small coffee pot and set it near the coals of their fire. The familiar ritual of making morning coffee gave him time to think, while Ayanna watched with obvious curiosity. She had probably never seen coffee prepared this way, and when the rich aroma began to fill the clearing, her expression showed genuine interest. He offered her a cup of the steaming black liquid, showing her how hot it was by blowing on his own cup first. Ayanna accepted it carefully, inhaling the scent before taking a tentative sip. Her eyes widened slightly at the bitter taste, but she nodded her approval and drank more. Thomas smiled at her reaction and found himself wishing he could ask her what she thought of it. While they shared the coffee and some of his remaining jerky, Thomas considered their options. Cedar Ridge was at least 2 days' walk down the mountain, assuming normal travel conditions. With Ayanna unable to walk on her broken leg, the journey would take much longer, if it was even possible at all. His horse Copper could carry her, but the trail down from this hidden valley was treacherous even for an experienced rider with 2 good legs. Ayanna seemed to understand his dilemma. She pointed to herself, then to the mountains around them, and spoke a string of Apache words while making gestures with her hands. Thomas could not understand the language, but her meaning was clear enough. She was trying to tell him something about her people, probably where they might be found. Thomas pulled out a stick and began drawing in the dirt beside the fire. He sketched a rough map of the area as he knew it, showing the valley where they were camped, the trail that led down toward Cedar Ridge, and the general direction of the other landmarks he recognized. Ayanna watched intently, then took the stick from him and added her own marks to the crude map. She drew what appeared to be a river running east from their position, then pointed in that direction and said a word that sounded like Gila. Thomas nodded. He knew the Gila River, though he had never traveled that far east. Ayanna continued drawing, adding marks that might represent camps or villages, speaking softly in Apache as she worked. When she finished, Thomas studied the map and began to understand. Ayanna was not asking him to take her to Cedar Ridge. She was showing him the way to her people, to Apache camps somewhere along the distant river. It was a request that made sense from her perspective, but filled Thomas with unease. White men who approached Apache camps uninvited had a tendency not to return. But looking at Ayanna's injured leg, Thomas realized they might not have much choice. She needed medical attention that was beyond his ability to provide, and her own people would know how to treat the injury properly. The question was whether he could get her there alive, and whether her people would allow him to leave alive afterward. Thomas pointed to his own chest, then to her, then in the direction she had indicated. Ayanna nodded eagerly, then spoke again in Apache. This time her tone was serious, almost formal, and Thomas had the impression that she was making him some kind of promise. Whether it was a promise to speak for him to her people, or simply a promise to remember his kindness, he could not tell. The decision made, Thomas began to prepare for the journey. He cut 2 straight branches from a nearby pine tree and used strips of leather from his pack to lash them together into a crude but functional crutch for Ayanna. It would not allow her to walk normally, but it might enable her to move short distances when necessary. More challenging was the problem of getting her down from the valley to where he had left Copper. The trail was steep and rocky, impossible for someone with a broken leg to navigate even with a crutch. Thomas studied the terrain carefully, then began cutting longer poles and gathering pine boughs. Ayanna watched with growing understanding as Thomas constructed a travois, a simple but effective device that could be dragged behind his horse to carry an injured person. He had never built one himself, but he had seen them used by Indians and mountain men. The concept was simple enough: 2 long poles with a platform of woven branches between them. As he worked, Ayanna offered suggestions with gestures and occasional words. She seemed familiar with the construction of such devices, and her input helped him avoid several design errors that might have made the travois unstable or uncomfortable. Working together, they completed the project by midday. Thomas tested the travois carefully, loading it with rocks to simulate Ayanna's weight and dragging it around the clearing to check for weak points. Satisfied that it would hold together, he helped Ayanna position herself on the woven platform and secured her as gently as possible with strips of cloth torn from his extra shirt. The descent from the hidden valley was slow and nerve-wracking. Thomas had to lead his horse step by careful step down the narrow trail, constantly watching to make sure the travois did not catch on rocks or tip over the edge. Ayanna endured the jarring ride without complaint, though Thomas could see the pain in her face every time the travois bounced over an obstacle. By late afternoon, they had reached the lower country where the trail became wider and less treacherous. Thomas was able to mount Copper and ride, leading the travois behind him as they made better time through the pine forests. Ayanna had fallen into an exhausted sleep, her body finally succumbing to the pain and stress of the journey. As the sun began to set, Thomas started looking for a suitable place to make camp. The country here was more open, with scattered meadows between the stands of timber. It was also more dangerous, closer to areas where Apache raiders might be encountered. Thomas chose a small grove of aspen trees near a creek, a place that offered some concealment while providing water for themselves and Copper. He was building their evening fire when Ayanna finally woke. She lay still for a moment, getting her bearings, then struggled to sit up on the travois. Thomas moved quickly to help her, supporting her back while she adjusted to a more comfortable position. She looked around at their new surroundings, then pointed east toward where the land seemed to open into broader valleys. "Kila," she said, and Thomas nodded. They were heading in the right direction, though they still had a long way to go. That evening, as they shared another meal beside their small fire, Thomas found himself thinking about what would happen when they reached Ayana's people. He had no illusions about the dangers he would face. The Apache had good reason to distrust white men, and his sudden appearance with an injured woman might easily be misinterpreted. But as he watched Ayana carefully cleaning her knife by the firelight, Thomas realized that she was probably thinking about the same problem. She spoke to him softly in Apache, and though he could not understand the words, her tone suggested that she was trying to reassure him about something. On impulse, Thomas pulled out his own knife and laid it on the ground between them. Then he pointed to her knife and nodded encouragingly. Ayana looked puzzled for a moment, then seemed to understand. She placed her knife beside his, and they both stared at the two weapons lying side by side in the firelight. It was a small gesture, perhaps meaningless, but it felt important to Thomas. Two people from different worlds, trusting each other enough to set aside their weapons. He hoped it might mean something to her people as well when the time came. The second day of their journey took them through increasingly rugged country. The mountains gave way to high desert, with strange rock formations jutting from the earth like ancient monuments. Thomas had never traveled this far east, and he found himself relying more and more on Ayana's guidance as they moved through country that was foreign to him. She had grown stronger during the night, and though her leg was still badly injured, her spirits seemed improved. She began to talk more, pointing out landmarks and occasionally saying words in English that she had apparently learned somewhere. "Water," she would say, pointing to a distant creek. "Horse," when she wanted to indicate something about Copper's condition. Thomas tried to reciprocate, teaching her English words for things they encountered on the trail. "Tree," he would say, pointing to a pine. "Rock," indicating a boulder. "Sky," looking up at the vast blue expanse above them. Ayana was a quick learner, and soon they had developed a basic vocabulary that allowed for simple communication. It was late in the afternoon of the second day when they saw the smoke. Thomas had been scanning the horizon ahead when he spotted the thin gray column rising from a valley perhaps 5 miles to the east. Ayana saw it at the same moment and spoke excitedly in Apache, pointing toward the smoke with obvious relief. Thomas felt his stomach tighten with nervousness. The smoke almost certainly meant people, and in this country, people probably meant Apache. There was no turning back now. Ayana needed help that only her people could provide, and Thomas had committed himself to getting her there safely. They approached the valley carefully, Thomas keeping his rifle ready, but not obviously displayed. As they drew closer, he could see that the smoke came from several fires, suggesting a fair-sized camp. Ayana grew more animated as they traveled, calling out occasionally in Apache, probably hoping that sentries might hear her voice and recognize it. The response came sooner than Thomas expected. One moment they were alone on the trail, the next moment they were surrounded by Apache warriors who seemed to have materialized from the rocks and brush around them. Thomas counted at least 6 men, all armed with rifles and looking distinctly unfriendly. For a tense moment, nobody moved. Thomas sat very still on Copper's back, his hands visible and well away from his weapons. The warriors studied him with hard eyes, clearly trying to decide whether to shoot him immediately or find out what he was doing with one of their women. Then Ayana spoke, her voice strong and clear despite her obvious pain. She talked rapidly in Apache, gesturing toward Thomas and then to her injured leg. The warriors listened. their expressions gradually changing from hostile suspicion to puzzled interest. One of them, an older man with intricate tattoos on his arms, asked her questions that she answered at length. Thomas understood none of the conversation, but he could see that Ayanna was telling the story of her rescue. Several times she pointed to him and said words that sounded respectful rather than fearful. The older warrior approached the travois and examined her broken leg, his expression growing concerned as he saw the extent of her injury. After what seemed like an eternity of discussion, the older man turned to Thomas and spoke in heavily accented but understandable English. "You help, woman?" "Yes," Thomas replied simply, not trusting himself to say more. The warrior studied him for another long moment, then nodded slowly. "You come." "Medicine woman see leg." It was not exactly an invitation, but it was better than being shot. Thomas nodded his understanding and allowed himself to be escorted toward the Apache camp, surrounded by warriors who kept their weapons ready but no longer pointed directly at him. As they approached the collection of wickiups that made up the camp, Thomas could see curious faces peering out at them. Word of their arrival had already spread, and people were gathering to see the white man who had rescued one of their own. Children ran alongside the travois, chattering excitedly, while women emerged from their shelters to get a better look. The camp was larger than Thomas had expected, with perhaps 30 or 40 wickiups arranged in a loose circle around a central fire area. Horses grazed in a nearby meadow, and he could see that this was a well-established settlement, not just a temporary hunting camp. They were led to one of the larger wickiups, where an elderly Apache woman waited with several assistants. This was obviously the medicine woman the warrior had mentioned, and Thomas felt a surge of relief as he saw her take charge of Ayanna's care. Whatever happened to him, Ayanna would receive the help she needed. The medicine woman directed several men to carefully lift Ayanna from the travois and carry her into the wickiup. As they disappeared inside, Thomas found himself standing alone with Copper, surrounded by curious Apache people who seemed unsure what to do with him. The older warrior who had first spoken to him approached again, this time accompanied by a younger man who carried himself with the bearing of a leader. The younger man studied Thomas carefully before speaking in English that was much more fluent than the older warrior's. "I am called Running Bear by your people. Ayanna is my sister's daughter. She has told us what you did for her." Thomas nodded, unsure how to respond to this information. Having a family connection could work in his favor, or it could make things much worse if the family decided he was somehow responsible for Ayanna's injury. Running Bear continued, "She says you carried her for 2 days, that you could have left her to die but chose to help instead. Is this true?" "It is true," Thomas replied. "I found her trapped under a rock. I could not leave her there." Running Bear translated this for the benefit of the other warriors who had gathered around them. Thomas heard the word trapped repeated several times in Apache, and he wondered what interpretation they were placing on his story. After another brief discussion among the warriors, Running Bear turned back to Thomas. "Ayanna says you made promise to bring her to her people. You have done this thing. Now we must decide what to do with you." It was not the most encouraging statement Thomas had ever heard, but at least they were talking instead of shooting. He decided that honesty was probably his best strategy under the circumstances. "I made no promise except to help her," he said. "I brought her here because she needed medicine that I could not provide. I ask only to be allowed to leave in peace." Running Bear studied him for a long moment. White men do not usually risk their lives for Apache women. "Why did you do this thing?" Thomas thought about the question carefully before answering. "Because it was the right thing to do. She needed help, and I was able to give it." This answer seemed to surprise Running Bear, who translated it for the other warriors. The response was a murmur of discussion, with some nodding approval, while others remained skeptical. As the day faded into evening, Thomas found himself in the strange position of being an honored guest who was also essentially a prisoner. He was provided with food and allowed to care for Copper, but warriors always remained nearby, watching his every move. The camp had settled into its evening routine, with fires being lit and the smell of cooking meat filling the air. Thomas was sitting by his own small fire, wondering what the next day would bring, when Running Bear approached him again. The Apache leader sat down across from him without invitation, studying Thomas's face in the flickering light. "Medicine Woman says Ayana's leg will heal," Running Bear said. "It was well set, and there is no poison in the wound. She will walk again, though perhaps with some difficulty." Thomas felt a surge of relief at this news. "I am glad to hear it. She is a brave woman." "Yes, she is," Running Bear agreed. "She is also very grateful to you. She has asked me to tell you that her family owes you a debt." Thomas shook his head. "No debt is owed. I did what anyone should do." "But not what anyone would do," Running Bear pointed out. "Most white men would have seen an Apache woman and ridden away. Some would have seen her as an enemy to be killed." The truth of this statement hung in the air between them. Thomas had no argument to make against it, because he knew it was accurate. Running Bear continued. "Ayana has told us that you shared your food and water with her, that you built a fire to keep her warm, that you protected her during the night. She says you treated her with honor, as you would treat a woman of your own people." "She deserved no less," Thomas replied simply. This answer seemed to satisfy Running Bear, who nodded slowly. "Tomorrow, the elders will meet to decide what to do about you. Ayana will speak for you, as will I. But the decision will not be ours alone to make." Thomas understood. He had entered Apache territory uninvited, and despite the circumstances, some members of the tribe might still view him as a threat or an enemy. His fate would be decided by people he had never met, based on their assessment of his character and intentions. As Running Bear rose to leave, he paused and looked back at Thomas. "The woman you saved is the daughter of our war chief. He died 2 winters ago fighting your soldiers, and his wife died of grief the following spring. Ayana is all that remains of his line." With that sobering piece of information, Running Bear disappeared into the darkness, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts and the growing realization that his simple hunting trip had entangled him in something far more complex and dangerous than he had ever imagined. The night sounds of the Apache camp settled around him. Quiet conversations, the crying of children, the movement of horses in the darkness. Somewhere nearby, Ayana was receiving the care she needed, probably telling and retelling the story of their journey together. Thomas could only hope that her words would be enough to save his life when morning came. Thomas woke to the sound of children playing near his fire, their laughter mixing with the morning songs of birds in the cottonwood trees that lined the creek. For a moment he forgot where he was, then reality returned with the weight of uncertainty pressing on his chest. Today, the Apache elders would decide his fate. The camp was already bustling with activity as women prepared the morning meal and men tended to horses and weapons. Thomas noticed that while people were curious about him, they were not hostile. Children pointed at him and whispered to each other, but they did not seem afraid. Several women had brought him food during the night, jerky, corn cakes, and a bitter tea that had helped him sleep despite his worries. As he sat by his dying fire, Thomas saw Ayana being helped out of the medicine woman's wickiup by 2 other women. She was leaning heavily on a new crutch made from oak wood, but she was standing upright, and her color looked much better than it had during their difficult journey. When she saw him watching, she smiled and raised her hand in greeting. Running Bear appeared at Thomas's side as if he had materialized from thin air. "She walks," he said with obvious satisfaction. "The medicine woman says the bone will mend straight and strong. Your quick action saved her leg." Thomas nodded, feeling a genuine sense of relief. "I am glad." "Will she be able to speak to the elders?" She has already spoken to them, Running Bear replied. They met before dawn to hear her story. Now they will discuss what it means. This was news to Thomas, who had been unaware that any meeting had taken place. He wondered what Ayanna had told the elders about their time together, and whether her words would be enough to secure his safe passage home. Running Bear seemed to read his thoughts. Do not worry about things you cannot control. Ayanna spoke well of you. She told them how you freed her from the rock, how you shared your food and water, how you protected her honor during the nights you spent together. She said you could have taken advantage of her weakness but chose instead to treat her as you would your own sister. The sun climbed higher as Thomas waited, trying to stay calm despite the uncertainty of his situation. Several Apache men approached him during the morning, some speaking broken English, others communicating with gestures. They seemed genuinely curious about his life in Cedar Ridge, his work as a carpenter, and why he chose to hunt alone in the mountains. Thomas answered their questions honestly, sensing that word of everything he said would reach the elders. One young warrior named Swift Horse spoke relatively good English and stayed to talk longer than the others. He had learned the language from traders and was eager to practice it. Through their conversation, Thomas learned more about the Apache way of life, their deep connection to the land, their complex social structure, and their ongoing struggles with white settlers and soldiers. Many of our people have died fighting your soldiers, Swift Horse told him. Others have been forced onto reservations far from the land of their fathers. We who remain here do so because we refuse to surrender our freedom, but we know that each day might be our last. Thomas listened to these words with growing understanding of the precarious position in which these people lived. They were not the savage raiders that frontier newspapers often portrayed, but families trying to preserve their way of life in the face of overwhelming pressure from an expanding white civilization. Mid-morning brought a flurry of activity as people began gathering in the central area of the camp. Thomas could see that this was the beginning of some kind of formal proceeding, probably the council meeting that would determine his future. Running Bear approached him one final time. It is time, he said simply. The elders are ready to hear from you. Thomas followed Running Bear to where a circle of older Apache men and women had seated themselves around a small fire. These were clearly people of importance within the tribe, their weathered faces showing the wisdom and authority that came with many years of leadership. Ayanna sat to one side of the circle, her injured leg stretched out in front of her, but her back straight with dignity. Running Bear indicated where Thomas should sit, then took his own place among the elders. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Thomas could feel the weight of many eyes upon him as the elders studied this white man who had unexpectedly entered their lives. Finally, an elderly woman with intricate silver jewelry and deeply lined face spoke in Apache. Running Bear translated her words. She is called Grandmother Willow. She asks why a white man would risk his life to help an Apache woman when our peoples are enemies. Thomas had expected this question and had thought carefully about his answer. We are not enemies by choice, he replied, speaking slowly so that Running Bear could translate accurately. We are made enemies by fear and misunderstanding. When I found Ayanna trapped and in pain, I did not see an Apache woman. I saw a human being who needed help. This answer provoked considerable discussion among the elders. Some nodded approvingly while others seemed less convinced. Another elder, a man with scars on his face and hands, spoke next. He asks if you expect some reward for what you did, Running Bear translated. Some payment from our people. I expect nothing, Thomas replied. I ask only to be allowed to return home in peace. What I did for Ayanna, I did because it was right, not because I hoped for gain. The elderly woman called Grandmother Willow spoke again, this time at some length. As Running Bear listened, his expression grew increasingly surprised. When she finished, he turned to Thomas with wonder in his eyes. She says that her grandmother told her stories of the old days when white men and Apache sometimes lived in peace. She says there were white men who understood that the earth belongs to all people, who treated Apache with respect and honor. She thought such white men no longer existed. Thomas felt the weight of this statement. He was being measured not just as an individual, but as a representative of his entire race. The responsibility was overwhelming, but he knew that he could only speak for himself. "I cannot answer for all white men," he said carefully. "I can only say that I believe good people exist among all races, just as bad people exist among all races. I judge each person by their actions, not by the color of their skin or the tribe they were born into." This prompted another long discussion among the elders. Thomas noticed that Ayanna was contributing to the conversation, occasionally speaking earnestly to one elder or another. Her words seemed to carry considerable weight in the deliberations. The scarred elder spoke again, and this time his tone seemed less hostile. Running Bear translated with obvious relief. "He says that Ayanna has told them how you built the fire each night and slept always between her and the darkness, protecting her even while you slept. He says this shows you understood your responsibility to guard her honor as well as her life." Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He had indeed been conscious of the need to protect Ayanna's reputation as well as her physical safety, knowing that any suggestion of impropriety could have serious consequences for her within her own community. The discussion among the elders continued for what felt like hours. Thomas sat quietly, listening to the rhythm of Apache voices even though he could not understand the words. Occasionally, Running Bear would provide a brief translation of particularly important points, but for the most part, Thomas simply had to wait and hope. The sun was high overhead when Grandmother Willow finally spoke with an air of finality. The other elders nodded their agreement, and Thomas saw smiles on several faces. Running Bear turned to him with obvious relief. "It is decided. The elders have agreed that you are a man of honor who acted with courage and selflessness. You are welcome to remain in our camp as a guest for as long as you wish, and when you choose to leave, you will go with our blessing and protection." Thomas felt a surge of relief so powerful that his hands actually trembled. "I am grateful for their wisdom and mercy," he said, "but I think it would be best if I left soon. My absence from Cedar Ridge will be noticed, and I do not want to bring trouble to your people." This practical consideration seemed to impress the elders, who nodded their approval of his thoughtfulness. Grandmother Willow spoke again, and this time her tone was warm and welcoming. "She says you are welcome to return to visit us whenever you wish," Running Bear translated. "She says a man who helps Apache people will always have friends among the Apache people." The formal council ended with the elders rising and approaching Thomas one by one to offer their personal thanks and blessings. Some spoke in Apache, others in broken English, but all conveyed the same message of gratitude and respect. Thomas was deeply moved by this demonstration of acceptance from people who had every reason to view him as an enemy. As the crowd began to disperse, Ayanna approached him slowly, still favoring her injured leg but moving with determination. She spoke to him in Apache, her tone formal and ceremonial. Running Bear remained nearby to translate. "She says that by Apache law she owes you her life. She asks what she can give you to show her gratitude." Thomas shook his head. "She owes me nothing. I am simply glad that she is safe and healing." Ayanna seemed to have expected this answer. She reached into a small pouch at her belt and withdrew something wrapped in soft leather. Unfolding the leather, she revealed a small piece of carved turquoise in the shape of a bird, a hawk or eagle, beautifully detailed despite its tiny size. She pressed the carving into Thomas's hand and spoke again. Running Bear translated with a smile. "She says this belonged to her father. It was carved by his grandfather and has been in her family for many generations." She wants you to have it as a token of friendship between our peoples." Thomas stared down at the small carving, overwhelmed by the significance of the gift. This was not just a piece of jewelry, but a family heirloom with deep cultural and spiritual meaning. To give it to him represented an extraordinary gesture of trust and respect. "I am honored," he said quietly. "I will treasure it always." The remainder of Thomas's time in the Apache camp passed quickly. The elders had declared that he should be treated as an honored guest, and the entire community embraced this designation with enthusiasm. Children who had been shy around him the previous day now competed for his attention, showing him their games and trying to teach him Apache words. Women brought him food and small gifts, while men shared stories of hunting and warfare. Thomas found himself particularly drawn to the older members of the community, who told him stories of the time before the great conflicts between white settlers and Apache people. These tales spoke of a different era, when cultural differences were often bridges to friendship rather than barriers to understanding. Swift Horse spent considerable time with Thomas, eager to learn more about white culture and customs. Through their conversations, Thomas gained a deeper appreciation for the complexity and richness of Apache society. These were not the primitive savages portrayed in frontier newspapers, but sophisticated people with their own complex social structures, spiritual beliefs, and cultural traditions. On the morning of his departure, Thomas was surprised to discover that he would not be leaving alone. Running Bear announced that he and 2 other warriors would escort Thomas partway back toward Cedar Ridge, both as a gesture of honor and to ensure his safe passage through country that might be patrolled by hostile Apache bands who had not been part of the council's decision. The farewell was emotional and dignified. Ayanna presented him with a pair of moccasins that the women of the camp had made during his visit, beautifully decorated with beadwork and perfectly fitted to his feet. The elders offered formal blessings for his journey, and Grandmother Willow gave him a small pouch of herbs that she said would help heal cuts and wounds. As Thomas mounted Copper and prepared to leave, he realized that this experience had changed him in ways that he was only beginning to understand. He had entered these mountains as a solitary hunter seeking only game and silence. He was leaving as a man who had found something far more valuable, an understanding that the barriers between peoples were often more imagined than real. The ride back toward Cedar Ridge took 2 days, with Running Bear and his companions sharing their knowledge of the country and pointing out landmarks that Thomas had never noticed before. They spoke of the old days when Apache and white traders sometimes worked together, and of their hopes that such cooperation might someday be possible again. When they finally reached the point where their paths would diverge, the parting was marked by the same dignity and respect that had characterized Thomas's entire time with the Apache people. Running Bear clasped his hand in the white man's style, then offered the traditional Apache gesture of touching his heart. "You will always be welcome among our people," Running Bear said. "If you are ever in need of help or shelter, seek out any Apache camp and speak the name of Ayanna. They will know that you are a friend." Thomas rode the final miles to Cedar Ridge alone, his mind full of memories and his heart heavy with the knowledge of what he had learned about the conflicts between his people and Ayanna's people. The small turquoise carving rested close to his heart, a tangible reminder of the friendship that could exist between peoples if they chose to see each other as human beings rather than enemies. When he finally reached town, Thomas was greeted with relief and curiosity from his neighbors, who had begun to worry about his extended absence. He told them simply that he had been delayed by bad weather and difficult traveling conditions. Some aspects of his experience were too precious and too complex to share with people who might not understand their significance. In the days that followed, Thomas returned to his normal routine of carpentry work and helping local ranchers, but the turquoise carving remained with him always, and sometimes in the evening he would take it out and remember the courage and kindness of an Apache woman named Ayanna. More importantly, he found that his perspective on the conflicts between white settlers and native peoples had been forever changed. When he heard men in the saloon talking about Indian problems and calling for more aggressive military action, Thomas would think of Grandmother Willow and Swift Horse and Running Bear, and he would quietly speak up for a different approach. He never again heard news of the specific Apache band that had welcomed him, but he followed reports from the territory with new interest and concern. When he learned of successful negotiations between Apache leaders and government officials, he felt a surge of hope that perhaps the wisdom and restraint he had witnessed in that remote camp might somehow influence the larger course of events. Years later, Thomas would still make his annual hunting trips to the mountains, though he never again traveled to the hidden valley where he had first encountered Ayanna. But sometimes, on clear days when the wind was right, he would climb to high places and look east toward the distant Gila River country, wondering about the people who had shown him such unexpected kindness and hoping that they had found the peace and security that all people deserved. The small turquoise carving became his most treasured possession, a reminder that in a world too often divided by fear and misunderstanding, individual acts of courage and compassion could still build bridges between peoples. Thomas McKenna had gone into the mountains seeking elk and had found instead a lesson in the fundamental humanity that connects all people, regardless of the color of their skin or the culture of their birth. It was a lesson he carried with him for the rest of his life, and one that he hoped might somehow contribute to a future where such understanding could flourish between all peoples who shared the vast and beautiful land of the American West.